Reports are emerging that a rift is widening amid growing tension between Prince Harry and King Charles.
The pen moved only once, but the consequences reached across generations. Behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, King Charles placed his signature beneath a decree no modern royal household had ever expected to confront. With that single act, Harry's title of prince was ordered removed from every official royal record. This was not a temporary punishment, a warning, or a negotiating tactic. It was an erasure, and a father had personally authorized it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles entered the private office knowing the morning would divide his family. A red dispatch box waited beside the decree, while a constitutional secretary stood nearby. The dispatch box was the secure case used for the monarch's papers, and the decree was a command issued under royal authority. Together, they turned private pain into official action. The king read every line again. The order removed Harry's prince title from the royal family website, the court circular, ceremonial registers, patronage records, official biographies, and future palace communications. The court circular was the official daily record of royal duties, so the change would reshape how the monarchy named him from that day onward. Charles lowered the pen and asked whether any path for restoration remained. The secretary answered softly, the wording was permanent. He did not sign immediately. His hand remained above the page, as though one final pause might recover lost trust. Camilla watched and saw no triumph. The queen consort understood that he was not acting like a victorious sovereign. He looked like a father forcing himself to close a door he believed would always remain open. The decree contained one further instruction. Earlier records would survive, but digital and public references would be amended, creating a divide between Harry's birth identity and the one the crown would now recognize. Charles ordered that his son must hear the decision privately before any announcement. An aide entered and revealed that the document had reached the royal records system. The machinery could no longer be stopped. The monarch pressed the decree flat with both hands, removed his reading glasses, and whispered, "Then it is done." Camilla reached toward him, but he rose before she could touch his arm. A sealed notification was prepared for Harry. At that moment, William received a separate summons containing only 5 words. Your brother must be told today. But before Harry could understand what had been taken from him, William would have to decide whether he was entering that conversation as the future king, or as the brother who still remembered the boy behind the title. Long before decrees, palace files, and constitutional language divided them, William and Harry had shared something far more powerful than rank: grief. They walked behind the same coffin, endured the same cameras, and carried the same absence into adulthood. Yet the crown did not ask them to carry that pain equally. One was trained to inherit the institution. The other spent years searching for a place inside it. Now their father's signature had turned that difference into a permanent separation. William stood beside the fireplace with the sealed summons in his hand, anger rising before he broke the wax. As heir, he had been trained to protect the monarchy he would one day lead. Harry, as the second son, had served beside it without ever controlling its direction. Their titles marked different duties, but they also proved both brothers still belonged. The prince opened the briefing and read the first paragraph twice. A private genealogy, the family's internal record of birth and descent, would still name Harry as Charles's son. Yet the decree would remove prince wherever the crown officially presented him. That distinction preserved blood while stripping away recognition. William lowered himself into a chair when the words, permanent removal, became impossible to misunderstand. He blamed his brother for the battles, interviews, and wounds that had pushed Charles toward this decision. Still, resentment turned toward the king for making him the messenger of something no apology could reverse. Catherine entered quietly and saw the summons trembling in his hand. She asked whether Charles was punishing disloyalty or shielding the monarchy from a deeper threat. William gave no answer. The future king had not seen the hidden file behind the decree, and his silence told her that duty had reached the edge of trust. Across the ocean, Harry noticed several unanswered calls from a palace number. Meghan watched his expression harden and understood this was not a ceremonial invitation. For him, the title was tied to childhood, service, and the mother he had lost. For her, its removal threatened to erase her husband from the history that shaped him. Charles faced a father's shame and a sovereign's legacy. William carried obedience. Harry stood to lose the last official sign that he belonged. Meghan feared the family would rewrite his place before he could defend it. At the bottom of the briefing, William found one final reference: a private confrontation during a memorial ceremony, concealed from the public until now. The discovery made his next duty far heavier. That concealed incident had not merely embarrassed the monarch, it had convinced Charles that Harry's title was being used in a way the crown could no longer control. The decree did not begin with a lawyer, a newspaper headline, or a hostile palace meeting. It began at a memorial service, where silence was expected, and unity was supposed to be sacred. Behind a closed antechamber, only minutes before the family entered the chapel, Charles asked his younger son for one private assurance. Harry's answer lasted less than a minute. Yet every person who later read the confidential account understood that this was the moment the king stopped waiting for reconciliation. Charles had endured growing tension as Harry used his princely identity during public campaigns, private negotiations, and international appearances without palace approval. The title Prince was more than a family label. It signaled that its holder belonged to the sovereign's house and could be mistaken for an official royal voice. Removing it would expose a constitutional break and the collapse between father and son. The king chose the memorial ceremony for Queen Elizabeth, hoping shared grief would soften the younger man's resistance. Inside the antechamber, he placed a written undertaking on the table. An undertaking was a formal promise, and this one required Harry to stop using his title in commercial partnerships, political advocacy, or independent diplomatic activity. Harry read the page and refused. He told Charles that the title belonged to his birth and could not be activated or suspended whenever the palace found it useful. The monarch heard more than defiance. He heard rejection of his authority and of every compromise he had delayed the crisis to preserve. William entered after raised voices reached the corridor. The prince found his brother rigid beside the door, while their father gripped the back of a chair. Harry looked toward him, but neither spoke. William understood that any word might turn the fracture into open war. Harry placed the unsigned undertaking on the table and warned that any attempt to rewrite his identity would be answered publicly. A confidential meeting summary recorded those words, documenting the threat for Charles. The ceremony continued, but the king's decision had changed. That evening, he ordered his constitutional secretary to prepare 3 options. Only one called for complete removal from official records. Charles circled it firmly in black ink. Harry closed the antechamber door slowly as he left. The monarch stared at the untouched chair, realizing restraint had made the rejection colder. The hidden account ended with one final instruction. Before the decree could be activated, Charles demanded one last face-to-face meeting. That final conversation would not happen across an ocean or through palace representatives. Father and son would confront each other directly, carrying years of grief into a room where neither could hide behind protocol. No aides remained. No secretary took notes. No carefully drafted statement stood between them. Charles and Harry faced one another in a private room at Clarence House, separated by a low table and years of accusations neither had ever fully confronted. The king had summoned a subject to answer for the use of a royal title. The father had invited a son to save what remained of their bond. Before the meeting ended, both men would understand that they could not preserve both. Charles had arranged the meeting during Harry's return to Britain and demanded privacy. William, Meghan, Camilla, and palace lawyers were kept away. Clarence House was the monarch's London residence, but that afternoon it felt less like a royal home than the final chamber of a family argument. The king placed 2 documents between them. One was the unsigned undertaking from the memorial ceremony. An undertaking was a formal written promise. The other was the completed decree waiting for authorization. The last signature needed to turn private intent into official command. Charles leaned forward and asked Harry to look at him. As your father, not as the king. He pleaded for limits on the title before the damage became permanent. Harry answered that the family invoked fatherhood only when obedience was required. Then said removing Prince from official records would never change who he was. The monarch's voice hardened. Birth had given his son a place within the family, he said. But public duty had given meaning to the title. Harry then revealed that he already knew a decree had been drafted. He accused William of supporting it, forcing Charles to admit that the decision belonged to him alone. Charles offered one last compromise. The title could remain in historical biographies if Harry signed the restrictions immediately. The younger son pushed the paper back without reading it again. That gesture ended the final path to retreat. Harry rose so abruptly that his chair dragged across the floor. The king remained seated and warned, "Once you leave, I cannot protect the name from the consequences." His son gripped the door handle but did not turn around. Harry answered, "Then keep the institution." The door closed. Charles folded the rejected undertaking in half, but his hands trembled as the paper bent. Minutes later, the monarch called William and requested his presence. He was not asking the heir for permission. He was preparing to explain what the prince would inherit once the decree took effect. For the decision was no longer only about Harry's identity. It was about the authority William would one day hold, and the burden Charles was preparing to place in his hands. The monarchy rarely displays how thoroughly it can alter a life without raising its voice. There are no public trials inside the palace, no dramatic votes before assembled crowds. There are files, signatures, archived instructions, revised forms, and carefully chosen language. When William entered the king's private library, he found Charles surrounded by the machinery of that silent power. His father was not asking whether the decree should proceed. He was showing the future king what obedience to the crown could cost. Charles explained that the decree had passed through royal legal advisors, the private secretary, the keeper of the royal archives, and palace communications officials. The private secretary was the monarch's senior advisor, while the keeper protected the crown's historical records. Their approval meant the decision was no longer personal anger. It had become institutional command. William read the briefing and understood the limit of royal power. The king could not change Harry's birth or remove him from the family's private genealogy, but he could decide how the royal household officially recognized, recorded, introduced, and remembered him. That distinction mattered because public identity inside the monarchy was controlled by documents, not emotion. The prince turned toward his father and objected to being summoned only after the decision had become irreversible. Inheriting the consequences, he said, was not the same as sharing responsibility for them. Charles admitted he had delayed involving him because he feared the future king would try to save his brother and weaken the throne's authority at the same time. William opened a confidential appendix and found the deeper danger. Several foreign hosts had asked whether Harry could appear internationally under princely status while acting independently of the crown. The same file confirmed that future official invitations could no longer address him as His Royal Highness or Prince, even during private ceremonies recorded by the palace. Catherine entered after Charles requested her judgment. She read one page, looked toward William, and quietly warned that removing a title might protect the crown while permanently damaging the family expected to represent it. Her words did not challenge the decree. They exposed its price. William carried the final clause to the window and read it twice. He asked whether his father had imagined Harry seeing his revised name for the first time. Charles answered, "Every night since I approved it." An aide entered before the prince could reply. The first digital alteration had already appeared on an internal royal database. The silent machinery had begun moving faster than any wounded family could. The decree had moved beyond private intention, and the first visible change would strike Harry before any palace statement could soften the blow. The first loss did not arrive with trumpets, television announcements, or a formal messenger at the door. It appeared on a screen. Harry refreshed an official royal page and watched the word that had followed him since birth disappear from beside his name. The biography remained. The dates remained. His military service and charitable work remained, but Prince was gone. In that quiet digital alteration, the decree became real, and the man at the center of it could no longer dismiss it as a palace threat. Harry stared as the page loaded again. Palace administrators had already begun updating internal directories and preparing matching changes across official platforms before the public announcement. Those directories were the monarchy's working records, used to identify family members in formal duties and communications. Once altered, the new wording would spread through every future royal reference. Meghan watched him refresh the page repeatedly. Disbelief hardened into anger as he said an entire lifetime had been reduced to an editable line. Moments later, secure correspondence arrived containing the formal notification, but the altered entry had reached him first. The institution had spoken before his father had. Harry opened the document and found the new form of address: Harry, Duke of Sussex. The dukedom was a royal rank tied to Sussex, yet the word prince had been removed from all current official use. A second page delivered a sharper wound. His children's existing titles remained untouched, leaving them formally connected to the crown, while their father was pushed outside its princely identity. Harry called Charles directly. The king saw his son's name appear, but advisors had warned that an undocumented conversation could disrupt implementation of the decree. He let the call end unanswered, choosing procedure while knowing silence would feel like rejection. The phone went face down. Harry lifted a framed childhood photograph of himself, William, and Charles, studied it, then placed it inside a drawer instead of throwing it away. Anger had given way to grief, and grief was harder to defend against. Meghan sat beside him and asked what he wanted to do next. Harry admitted he wanted to answer as a son, but no longer knew whether the palace would recognize that voice. She stayed beside him as the screen continued displaying the revised name. That evening, William sent a private message stripped of every royal phrase. "Meet me alone. No aides, no statements, just us." Neither man yet understood how much that meeting would demand. For the first time since the decree was signed, the next step would not be dictated by officials, lawyers, or the crown, but by two brothers deciding whether anything personal still survived beneath the titles. William arrived without an equerry. Harry entered without an advisor. There were no photographers, no palace papers, and no prepared demands placed between them. For one private hour, the heir to the throne and the man stripped of his princely recognition sat across from each other simply as brothers. Neither expected an apology large enough to repair the past. Yet both understood that unless one of them spoke honestly, their father's decree would become more than an official separation. It would become the final definition of their family. William had chosen a private country residence, far from palace offices, where no representative could interrupt or record them. An equerry was a royal aide who managed official duties, and the prince wanted none of that machinery nearby. Harry arrived convinced his brother had supported the removal. The future king admitted he understood the reasons, but Charles had made the decision without consulting him. Harry's anger surfaced quickly. He accused William of always benefiting from the system that punished him. The heir answered that privilege had not protected him from being shaped, controlled, and emotionally silenced by the same institution. Duty had given him power, but it had also taken away choices he could never recover. William told his brother that the title had never been the reason he loved him. Harry replied that it was still part of the identity their mother had taught them to carry together. Losing it felt like losing one more piece of the childhood they had once shared. The prince then revealed what Charles had kept outside the decree. The family archives, the private collection preserving royal history, would keep Harry's birth record exactly as written, including the title given to him as a child. The younger brother looked down and admitted he had rejected the final compromise, partly because accepting it would have meant publicly surrendering after years of insisting the palace could not define him. William placed their mother's handwritten birthday card between them. Neither touched it at first. Harry finally slid it toward the center, leaving it equally within reach. The future king said he would not challenge the decree, but Harry's children would never be treated as strangers by him. His brother offered no forgiveness, yet accepted the promise. They left separately as the palace prepared its announcement, unaware their meeting had changed what the world was about to witness. The crown would now speak in the cold language of authority, but beyond the palace gates, the world would interpret the decision through one unforgettable image of a family divided. By sunrise, the decree was no longer a family secret. It belonged to broadcasters, newspaper editors, constitutional commentators, cheering crowds, furious supporters, and millions of people refreshing the royal website to confirm what seemed impossible. Britain had witnessed resignations, scandals, separations, and exile. But this was different. The king had ordered his own son's princely identity removed from the monarchy's living records, transforming a private breakdown into a public act of royal authority that could never be unseen. Buckingham Palace released a brief statement confirming that every official reference would now follow the decree's wording. A decree was a formal command issued under royal authority, and this one changed how Harry would be named in palace records without explaining the private confrontation behind it. Broadcasters called the decision the sharpest symbolic separation between a reigning monarch and an adult son in the modern royal era. Charles watched the coverage alone and asked for the television sound to be lowered. Camilla noticed that he barely reacted to the political debate, yet listened closely whenever old footage of Harry's childhood was mentioned. The Queen Consort understood that the public saw authority, while the father beside her heard memories. Harry rejected an immediate televised interview. Meghan urged him to breathe before answering, and he told her that anger would allow the decree to define not only his title, but his character. She remained beside him as he chose silence over the response millions expected. A major London newspaper captured the shock in one brutal front page. Two versions of the royal website appeared side by side, one reading Prince Harry, the other Harry, Duke of Sussex. Beneath the headline, the word, "A King Removed." Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd gathered near the gates. An elderly veteran placed a small photograph of Harry in military uniform beside the railings. Nearby, another visitor quietly removed a handmade sign supporting the decree, shaken by the human cost behind the decision. A broadcaster then revealed, through a documented palace timeline, that Charles had signed the order before the final father-son confrontation. The king had entered that meeting prepared for failure, even while offering one last compromise. William faced the question at a scheduled engagement. When asked whether Harry remained his brother, the prince stopped and answered before the watching nation, "Nothing signed by any hand can alter that." Those words forced Charles toward the final truth. The crown had removed a title, but only the family could decide whether it had also removed a son. And when the king finally faced that distinction, he would deliver no second decree, only a private verdict on what his decision had protected, and what it had cost forever. The records were changed. The announcement was complete. The palace website no longer called him prince, and every future royal document would follow the same command. Yet when the noise faded, Charles was left with a truth no decree could amend. He had defended the monarchy's authority by drawing the clearest boundary of his reign. He had also confirmed, before the entire world, that the relationship with his younger son had reached a place where love and duty could no longer occupy the same line. Charles returned to the office where he had signed the decree. That command was a formal order carrying the monarch's authority, and it had now been fully applied across ceremonial communications, public biographies, internal directories, and every future palace announcement. Harry remained Duke of Sussex and the king's son by birth, but the royal household would no longer officially present or address him as a prince. The king found the desk almost empty. Only the pen remained. He lifted it, paused, then placed it inside a drawer, rather than displaying it as a symbol of strength. The crown had won clarity, but the father had gained nothing that felt like victory. Harry chose not to begin a public campaign against the decision. Through a restrained written statement, released by his representative, he accepted that institutions controlled their records while insisting that family identity could not be granted or removed by administration. His words carried no surrender. They carried exhaustion. William's private promise became the true turning point. The prince and his brother remained divided over the monarchy, yet both agreed their children would not inherit the bitterness that had shaped them. The future king understood that silence had done more damage than open conflict. Charles then wrote to Harry, without royal stationery, titles, or secretarial language. He did not withdraw the decree or apologize for defending the throne. He signed the letter with one word, Papa. Harry read it alone, folded it carefully, and placed it beside the childhood photograph hidden in his drawer. He did not return the picture to the shelf, but he did not throw it away. The decree succeeded politically by drawing a clear boundary around royal authority. Emotionally, it became a monument to failure. A king preserved the discipline of the crown only after a father and son had exhausted their trust. The monarchy remained standing, its records precise and its authority intact. But behind those corrected lines was the final truth of the decree. A title had been erased in seconds, while the love beneath it would take a lifetime to understand. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.